So today we're making a brand new tier list, ranking every meta unit in Anime Last Stand, as of the most recent Valentine's 2026 update. Keep in mind the rankings in this video are just my own opinion, but I still hope you find the video helpful. If you do, maybe leave a like or subscribe. But anyways, let's get into it. Okay, hello guys. It has been quite a while since our last tier list video. I think it's been like about a month. But I'm going to try and be pretty quick today. I don't want to waste all day talking about these units because World 3 is right around the corner. First up we have Boa. And Boa is just a support. She has Petrify and follow-up attacks for the strongest unit in her range. But she also has, I think, a 2000% damage buff for Gear 5 Luffy. So Gear 5 Luffy with that buff, going into a lower end of meta overall. Free Prisoner is going to pretty much replace Grammy in meta early. He's just very cheap, pretty good placement damage, and up to 8 placements if you need 8 placements for some reason. The Zombie, or Giselle, going into meta overall. Pretty strong unit. We've got some supporting value from like Blizzard, Freeze. Between all the different summons, he has pretty good damage, but not really much to talk about here. Now I think this girl's name is Hameya from Fire Force, I don't really know. But she is a really good damage dealer. She can ramp up pretty much the longer an enemy has Despair on them, the more she's going to buff her own damage. She can ramp up to like hundreds of billions of damage, which is really strong. Definitely going into meta overall. She's also very cheap to place down, so going into meta early for her pretty good placement damage. And also a little bit of supporting value through enemy debuffing. Of course we have Despair, we have Electrified, and if I remember correctly, enemies also walk slower and take more damage the closer they are to her. Overall pretty good supporting value, and a really strong unit. Now for Rias, we have another support-oriented unit, but she's a very good one, very good damage buffer, very good SPA buffer. And most importantly, in my opinion, she's going to give people a follow-up attack whenever she attacks, so very good for increasing overall damage output. And in my opinion, she's going pretty high into meta overall, mostly for her supporting value, but also pretty good damage output. Very expensive though, costs like 15 mil to max out, so keep that in mind. And the final unit of the Valentine's update, Maki and Yuta, also going into the support tier. Really good supporting value from Yuta, because Rika is going to have permanent Despair and Fear, and a pretty long stun for anything leaving her range. And there's also some time stopping from Yuta from his abilities, but not too important. Overall, Maki and Yuta have a lot going on, but very strong at the moment. Oh shoot, hold on, one more unit. I forgot about Corona, my bad. Cheap enough to be meta early, and really good damage, really good range, and full AoE on placement. Their whole gimmick is like damage over time ramping up, and just kind of raw damage, I don't know. Overall, pretty high damage, I would say, going into meta overall, right about here. They are pretty good at what they do. That was everyone for the new Valentine's update, but we do have a little bit to talk about for the update before that. Alucard got buffed, they increased his raw damage, that is all they did. Same exact unit as before, but more damage. Shinra got nerfed pretty hard. They nerfed a lot of his passives to no longer have like percent-based damage at all. His supporting value got nerfed a lot by like no more slowdown, no more cooldown reduction as much. And he's also a lot more restrictive on team building now, because you actually have to run certain elements on a team to use them right. He used to be like an RNG thing, you could roll random elements from his ability. Now you are limited to the elements you have on your team. So I don't think Shinra's meta, because like you don't want to build a team around Shinra to make him work in this meta. Don't get me wrong, he is still really good, but I feel like he doesn't really fit into meta anymore. For Rudo, I know I never really talked about the units from last update, but he can copy abilities if you fully ramp them up, so he's definitely meta infinite for being able to copy other people's really strong like nukes, for example. He also does just have pretty good DPS though, and perfect seal, so going pretty high into meta overall. Probably right about here for now. I don't know this guy's name, but he's a dismantle unit. He has a passive where his dismantle does 10 times damage, instead of whatever the normal multiplier is. He's pretty strong for raw damage and cheap enough to be meta early, so going probably right about here. And for meta overall, going probably right about here. This guy, also don't know his name, but he puts traps on the floor. He doesn't attack normally, but kind of like Wire Girl, if you guys remember during the Halloween update. I mean, he has really good DPS output, but it's like limited to small AoE, like pretty much single target. Going into the good tier, he does do a lot of damage with his traps, but I don't know, trap unit, kind of weird. I think this girl's name is Rio, maybe, or maybe Mio, I don't remember. He's pretty similar to the dismantled guy. Does a lot of raw damage, some bleed type effects and whatever. And she is cheap enough to be meta early, and has really good placement damage, so going pretty high. Jabber, if you couldn't guess from every unit from this update pretty much, really just has raw damage. I mean, it is really good raw damage. He has like poison that can crit, so potentially really high DPS and some supporting value from like he has a chance to stun the strongest unit in his range, and if he stuns it, he can buff their next attack for 3 attacks or so. I don't know, I mean, he has some nuance to him for sure. I mean, all these units kind of do, right? But for the most part, a lot of these units from this update were just raw damage, and Jabber is one of them. There were a couple more balance changes they rolled out with this update. They nerfed Kurumi's abilities, a couple of them to make him weaker, and also nerfed her percent HP drain, so she's not strong for infinites, I guess. But overall meta standing didn't change too much, her damage is already kind of on the decline, she's kind of getting power crept. But Kurumi had put into, of course, meta overall, meta infinite, and then also still a pretty good support from her bunch of different abilities she has from her menus, even though they got kind of nerfed. They also nerfed Jotaro over Heaven, just his nuke, that is all. So he's no longer meta infinite in my opinion. He was before because of his percent base damage nuke, but he no longer has that. So he's pretty much purely a support now for damage buffing and time stopping and whatnot. They also did something to Makima. Makima was broken before, one of her passives didn't work to like change the SPA of the units that she's debuffing. For a while this was bugged out with Echidna, where you can make Echidna do quadrillions of damage on placement, but I don't know if that's still a thing, I haven't checked in a while. I don't know, nothing really changed for Makima that update, she's going into the support tier. And there shouldn't really be much else to talk about now, other than, you know, ranking every other unit here and kind of briefly talking about what they do. But there are a couple I still want to talk about in a little bit more detail. I think I ranked Okura too high in my last tier list because he's just kind of raw damage, and he's already getting power crept in that regard because, you know, damage is always getting power crept. He is still definitely meta early, going right about here, and definitely still meta overall, going probably right about here. And then I think I had the opposite problem for Senku. Didn't rank him too high, but I ranked him too low. He got nerfed a while ago, but he didn't actually get nerfed all that hard. I mean, he did. But he is still pretty good for what he does. I mean, he's still a good farm, you know, money making, money buffer of some kind. But they nerfed his, like, infinite damage scaling for infinite, and it's actually not even that bad still. Like, it's pretty okay for meta infinite. I put him in here. They nerfed his damage buffing to only be like 150%, but it is still a damage buff and a pretty good one. I think he still belongs in the support tier, probably right about here. And then for his overall spot in the meta right now, I feel like he's actually pretty valuable because a lot of the new units are very expensive. Senku can help out with money in that way, and also pretty good for buffing, so he can get away with still going pretty high. Oh, I think last update they also nerfed a bowback. It wasn't really noticeable though. They just made it so his self buff of 450% requires you to have a buffable unit in his range, so you can't just place him down alone anymore and get the 450 buff. But the nerf didn't hit bowback too hard. He's still meta early for pretty good placement damage and farming up money. Definitely going into meta overall right now. And on the side, a pretty okay support for enemy debuffing and buffing the weakest unit in his range. Early is good for raw damage, and he does take a while to ramp up, so it can be good for meta infinite as well, if you ramp him up fully. Casca with Guts is a damage buffer. Boo is actually pretty versatile. He's got a lot of debuffing and able to clone a unit if you fully ramp him up, so pretty okay support in that way. He does take a really long time to ramp up, but, you know, being able to clone, like TUI Goku for example, makes him meta infinite because TUI Goku is broken. While we're here, let me go ahead and, you know, but overall I'd put Boo like right here. Lazy Cat, kind of just a gimmick unit. The damage isn't really too valuable anymore, but they have like a chance to one-shot stuff, so pretty good for infinites, I think. Yuki has some pretty strong nukes for infinites, but that's kind of all. Unohana has percent base damage for meta infinite. Diavolo could pretty much reset permanent cooldown, so very good for meta infinite. Coat Giver, I'm not sure how many people even have this guy from the Thanksgiving event, but he is just a good boss killer. I don't really have him, so I can't know exactly how good he is, okay, but take my word for it, he's just kind of good. Genos is also just kind of good. Raw damage, burn damage, I don't know. Rolo's a pretty interesting gimmick unit. He can copy the ability of a unit, so kind of like Rudo. Rudo's kind of a better version of him, but less consistent in what it does, I guess. Pretty good for meta infinite, just for that gimmick alone, but yeah, not too crazy for anything else. Anti-Spiral's an okay support with crit buffing and ability cooldown reduction. Gohan's kind of mid, all he has is raw damage and going into the good tier. Piccolo has been nerfed to the ground over time. All he has is raw damage, and he does take a while to fully ramp up, so I don't know, he's in the good tier in my opinion. Zoro, another unit that I think I overrated before in my last tier list because he's actually not that crazy. He has a lot of raw damage, but the way it works is like, if he attacks something more than once, his damage goes away. He's still pretty good for meta early, just because like he can one-tap stuff in the early wave, so pretty good. Kachi's going into the good tier, which kind of has raw damage and some like stunning and pressure. Android definitely going into meta overall, lots of like dot buffing and just crazy DPS as well. Rem and Ram going into support, pretty similar to Amaya with a passive where like the closer an enemy is, the more damage they take and the slower they walk. But we also have like Blizzard and Freeze and Frostbite on Rem, which is pretty good. Meliodas is actually kind of interesting because there's one thing about him that is really meta for infinites right now. His ability that is like a full counter thing, 45-second cooldown only. They forgot to remove decay from his ability, so he has like a guaranteed one shot over time. Very good for meta infinite right now just because like he's one of the only units with that in the game right now. He is still a pretty good support for slowing down enemies and having that follow-up attack thing, or like the, nuke that scales off the strongest unit in his range. And then he is cheap enough with pretty good damage to be meta early. Reinhardt is just kind of good nowadays for damage. Silver Chariot is still a really good buffer, kind of RNG on some buffs, but really good support overall. Natsu is going into the good tier for burn damage. Echidna is going into the good tier, still pretty good support value, but kind of gimmicky. So similar to the Trap guy, just kind of too gimmicky to be meta. Now personally for Trunks, I'm not a fan of this unit, because he's like kind of weird to fully ramp up and get going. But he is overall very strong in the meta right now, and does have percent base damage and walk back, so pretty good for meta infinite. Cosmic Garo is just kind of good for raw damage, I don't know, falling off. Of course, Regulus is still a good support with time stopping and SPA buffing. Felix is a good damage buffer. Rimuru, in my opinion, is really falling off. There's a huge trade-off to using him. Same thing for Madoka, I would say, because she cancels out like all buffing and debuffing once you get her into her form. But yeah, Madoka and Rimuru both are kind of like really good meta infinite units if you fully build them up. But you have to either sacrifice your entire team or sacrifice a lot of your team to use them properly. Diorno is going into meta infinite, pretty high in it for his Scorpion, scaling off of enemy max HP. Benimaru just kind of good for burn damage and he is pretty cheap. Simon going into a few tiers, he is still a good damage buffer with the 50 billion damage increase to anything. He is also meta infinite for raw damage, percent base damage, and nuking, kind of a mix of everything. And for meta overall, I know a lot of people might disagree, but I'm still going to put him pretty high just because of his godly lead. You usually want to run him as your godly leader to take advantage of the buff increase for TUI Goku, for example. So in my opinion, meta overall, Simon is still pretty high, probably like top 3. Guts is kind of falling off after they nerfed him really hard, pretty good for raw damage though. Escanor can be okay for buffing fire units and just kind of raw burn damage. Kokoshibo, okay for raw damage and like applying exposed, a little bit of support value there. Yuji, I think most people know, really good for raw damage going into the number 2 spot in meta overall. Very cheap and the best starter in the game right now going into the top of meta early. And going pretty high in meta infinite just because he can hit for like quintillions, which is insane. Kisuke is still a pretty good support with his ability menu and a lot of enemy debuffing. And also still pretty good for meta infinite because of his percent base damage on top of his supporting value. Boros is just good for raw damage. Virgil is just good for raw damage. In my opinion, Asta and Yuna are kind of falling off a little bit. They're still really good for meta early, but overall kind of falling off after the nerfs that happened like 3 updates ago. Gogeta is just pretty good for raw damage and nuking. Wongling's meta infinite for rewinding and ability resetting and a one-shot nuke. Heinz is pretty okay for raw damage and enemy debuffing. Death Sun is still pretty good for raw damage and nuking. Gucci is still pretty good for supporting value like time stopping and enemy debuffing. And for those same things, but also percent base damage, he's going into meta infinite. Hero's going into meta infinite, pretty underrated because he can execute anything below 15% HP. Dio is a pretty good support with time stopping and SPA reduction. Naruto just pretty good for kind of everything. His godly lead is okay for buffing, he's got good raw damage, he's got percent base damage, nuking. And finally, Frieren is going at the very bottom. I feel like in some situations she is still pretty good and worth picking up if you don't have her, but she is still really falling off. And here we have the final rankings. Of course, everything in this video is just my own opinion. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments down below. But also, don't take any of these rankings too seriously because we are going to get World 3 very soon, and these are probably not going to matter at all. I tried to get this tier list video out pretty quick, hopefully this helps you guys out because I know I kind of missed out on the last update. Sorry about that. But either way, thank you to my channel members for making the video possible. You guys are the best. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you in the next one, and have a great day.